The axe blade bit deep into the pine log, and Faith Carmichael wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of dirt across her sun-bronzed skin as she surveyed the foundation she had laid that morning in the shadow of the California mountains. It was August of 1872, and the land stretched out wild and untamed around her homestead claim 3 miles outside Ukiah, a town that had grown up around the old stagecoach route. She had been working since dawn, and the sun now hung high overhead, beating down mercilessly on the valley floor. Her blonde hair, twisted into a thick braid that hung down her back, had come loose in places, and strands stuck to her damp neck. At 23 years old, Faith had traveled across half a continent to claim this piece of earth as her own, and she would be damned if she let anything stop her from building the cabin she had dreamed about every night on that long journey west. The land agent in Ukiah had laughed when she told him she intended to build her own cabin without hiring men to do the work. He had actually laughed right in her face, his tobacco-stained teeth showing through his gray beard as he slapped his knee like she had told the finest joke he had heard in years. Faith had simply stared at him with those steady gray eyes until his laughter died away. Then she had signed her name on the claim papers with firm, clear strokes and walked out of his office without another word. That had been 6 weeks ago, and in that time she had cleared the land, dug a foundation, and begun hauling timber from the nearby forest to construct her home. She lived in a canvas tent for now, sleeping on a bedroll with her rifle beside her and her supplies carefully organized on wooden crates she had brought from Missouri. Every morning she rose before the sun and worked until her muscles screamed and her hands bled. Every evening she fell into her bedroll exhausted but satisfied, knowing she was one step closer to her dream. The money her father had left her when he died was nearly gone, spent on the land claim, supplies, and the journey west. But Faith had never been afraid of hard work. Her mother had died when Faith was just 12, and she had spent the next 11 years keeping house for her father and younger brother, cooking and cleaning and mending until her brother had married and brought home a wife who made it clear there was no longer room for Faith in the household. So Faith had taken her inheritance and headed west, where land was cheap, and a woman could make her own way if she had the strength and the will. She had heard stories about California, about the gold that had brought thousands of people flooding into the territory 20 years earlier, and about the valleys where a person could grow anything in the rich soil. Ukiah had seemed like a good place to start, nestled in a valley with mountains on either side and a creek that ran year-round through the property she had claimed. The sound of hoofbeats made her straighten up, shading her eyes against the sun as she watched a rider approach from the direction of town. She reached for the rifle leaning against the woodpile, not pointing it at the stranger but keeping it close. A woman alone had to be careful, especially out here where the nearest neighbor was more than a mile away. As the rider drew closer, she could make out more details. He sat tall in the saddle, wearing a dusty brown hat and dark pants tucked into worn boots. A horse trailed behind his mount, laden with supplies from the look of the packs strapped across its back. The man slowed his horse as he approached, raising one hand in a gesture of peace. Faith noticed he wore a gun belt, but his hand was nowhere near the pistol at his hip. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath his hat, and his face was tanned from long hours in the sun. When he was close enough that she could see his eyes, a startling shade of blue against his weathered skin, he pulled his horse to a stop and touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Afternoon, madam," he said, his voice a low drawl that carried easily across the distance between them. "Name is Xavier Donnelly. I have the ranch about 5 miles west of here, up against the foothills. Heard from folks in town that someone had claimed this land, but I have got to admit I did not expect to find you out here building a cabin all by yourself." Faith set the rifle down, but did not step away from it. She studied him carefully, taking in the way he sat relaxed in his saddle, the quality of his horse and tack that suggested he was a man of some means, and the directness of his gaze that met hers without the condescension she had grown used to seeing in men's eyes. "Faith Carmichael," she said finally. "And I appreciate the introduction, Mr. Donnelly. But if you rode all the way out here to tell me I cannot build my own cabin, you wasted your time. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, and she noticed he had a small scar cutting through his left eyebrow. No, madam. I rode out here because I thought you might need some supplies. The general store in town told me you had not been in for a few weeks, and I figured you might be running low on things. I had to go to Sacramento for some business, and I picked up extra flour and coffee and such, thinking I would bring them by. Faith felt her defensive posture soften slightly, though she remained cautious. That is kind of you, but I can manage my own supplies. Xavier shifted in his saddle, and she saw something flicker across his face that might have been respect. I am sure you can, Miss Carmichael, but the thing is, I bought too much, and it will just go to waste at my place. My foreman is always telling me I buy more than we need when I go to the city. Thought maybe you could take some of it off my hands, save me from hearing him complain. It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it, but Faith appreciated the way he offered help without making it seem like charity. She had been running low on flour, and the coffee was long gone. Pride was all well and good, but it would not fill her stomach or give her the energy she needed to finish building her cabin before winter came. I suppose I could help you out with that problem, she said, allowing the smallest hint of a smile to touch her lips. Seeing as you came all this way. Xavier dismounted in one smooth motion, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. He was tall, probably just over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean, muscled build of a man who made his living working cattle. He began untying one of the packs from the trailing horse, moving with an easy confidence that spoke of long familiarity with such tasks. I have got to say, Miss Carmichael, that is some impressive work you have done here. How long have you been at it? 6 weeks, Faith said, walking over to help him with the supplies. Up close, she could smell leather and horse and something else, maybe sage or cedar. I have got the foundation laid and about half the logs I need cut and ready. Figure another month or two, and I will have the walls up. Then I can work on the roof before the weather turns. Xavier set a heavy sack of flour on the ground and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. You are doing all this yourself? The cutting, the hauling, everything. That is right, Faith said, meeting his eyes steadily. I know it is not what most people expect, but I have got 2 hands and a strong back, and I am not afraid to use them. He was quiet for a moment, and she braced herself for the lecture she had heard a dozen times before about how this was man's work and she should find herself a husband to take care of such things. But instead, Xavier just nodded slowly and said, I never met a woman like you. There was no mockery in his voice, no hint of the patronizing tone she had come to expect. He said it like a simple statement of fact, and something in Faith's chest tightened unexpectedly. She hadn't realized how much she had been craving that kind of straightforward acknowledgement, someone who could see what she was doing and appreciate it without trying to talk her out of it or make her feel like she was doing something wrong or unnatural. Well, she said, her voice coming out slightly rougher than she intended, I suppose I am not like most women you have met. Xavier carried the flour over to her tent, setting it carefully inside the opening where it would stay dry. That is not a bad thing, he said, returning for the coffee and other supplies. Most interesting people I have ever known were the ones who did not fit into the usual patterns. They worked together in companionable silence, unloading the pack horse and stowing everything in Faith's tent. Xavier had brought flour, coffee, sugar, salt pork, dried beans, and even a small tin of peaches that made Faith's mouth water just looking at it. It was far more than she could have afforded to buy herself, and certainly more than any casual neighborly gesture required. Mr. Donnelly, she said as he was preparing to leave, this is a lot of supplies. I appreciate the kindness, but I cannot accept charity. He turned to face her, and his blue eyes were serious. It is not charity, Miss Carmichael. Truth is, I could use some help myself if you are willing to trade labor for goods. Faith tilted her head, studying him. What kind of help? I have got a herd that needs moving to the upper pastures next week, and I am short a hand since one of my men broke his leg falling off a horse last month. You look like you can ride, and I am guessing you can handle a rope well enough if you have been doing all this construction work. If you could spare 3 days to help with the drive, I would call us even on the supplies and throw in enough lumber from my property to finish your cabin roof. It was a generous offer, possibly too generous, and Faith wondered if he was just trying to find a way to help her that would not bruise her pride. But she did need the lumber, and she was a good rider. Her father had taught her to handle horses when she was just a girl, and she had spent enough time on farms to know her way around cattle. 3 days, she said slowly. And you will provide the lumber for my roof? That is the deal, Xavier said, extending his hand. Faith shook it, his palm warm and calloused against hers, and felt a jolt of something she did not quite recognize travel up her arm at the contact. Then I will be there, Mr. Donnelly. Just tell me when and where. Next Tuesday at dawn, he said. I will come by here and show you the way to my ranch. And Miss Carmichael, you can call me Xavier. I think we are going to be neighbors for a while, and there is no point in standing on formality all the time. Then you can call me Faith, she said, and was rewarded with a genuine smile that transformed his serious face into something warmer and more approachable. After he rode away, Faith stood watching until he disappeared over the rise in the land. Then she turned back to her work with renewed energy. She split logs until her shoulders ached and her hands were raw, but she barely noticed the discomfort. Her mind kept drifting back to the way Xavier had looked at her cabin foundation, the respect in his voice when he said he had never met a woman like her, and the warmth of his hand when they shook on their bargain. That night, lying in her bedroll, with the stars visible through the open tent flap, Faith found herself thinking about blue eyes and the way a smile could change a man's entire face. She told herself firmly that she had not come all this way to get tangled up with a man, that her cabin and her independence were what mattered. But sleep was a long time coming, and when it did, her dreams were filled with the sound of hoofbeats and a low voice saying her name. The days until Tuesday passed in a blur of work. Faith finished cutting the rest of the logs she needed for the cabin walls and began the laborious process of notching and stacking them. Her back ached constantly, and her hands were covered in blisters that broke and reformed and broke again, but she kept at it with stubborn determination. Each log that went into place was a victory, proof that she could do this impossible thing she had set out to do. On Monday evening, she took extra care washing in the cold creek water and mending the cleanest of her work shirts. She told herself it was just because she wanted to make a good impression on Xavier's ranch hands, that it had nothing to do with Xavier himself. But the lie tasted bitter even in her own mind. Xavier arrived just as the sun was breaking over the eastern mountains on Tuesday morning, riding the same sturdy bay horse and leading a gentle-looking chestnut mare. Thought you might want to save your own horse, he called out as he approached. This is Rosie. She has got a sweet temperament, and she knows how to work cattle. Faith had been ready for an hour, her own provisions packed in a saddlebag, and her hat pulled low against the early morning light. She walked over to the chestnut mare and stroked her soft nose, murmuring a greeting. Rosie nickered softly and butted her head against Faith's shoulder in a friendly gesture. She likes you, Xavier observed, swinging down from his own horse. That is a good sign. Rosie does not take to everyone. Animals can usually tell when someone knows what they are doing, Faith said, checking the saddle and stirrups with practiced efficiency. And when someone will treat them right. The ride to Xavier's ranch took about an hour, following a winding trail that climbed gradually into the foothills. Xavier kept up a steady stream of conversation, pointing out landmarks and telling her about the valley and the people who had settled there. He had been in California for 8 years, he told her, having come west after serving in the war. He did not say which side he had fought for, and Faith did not ask. The war had ended 7 years ago, but the wounds it left behind were still fresh enough that people tended to avoid the subject. His ranch, when they reached it, was impressive in its solid practicality. The main house was a two-story structure built of local stone and timber with a wide porch that wrapped around three sides. There were several outbuildings, a large barn, and a series of corrals where horses moved restlessly in the early morning light. Beyond the buildings, Faith could see cattle dotting the hillsides, hundreds of them grazing on the summer grass. "You have built a good operation here," she said, genuine admiration in her voice. Xavier looked at her, and something warm flickered in his eyes. "Thank you. It has taken a lot of work and more than a few disasters, but I am proud of what we have managed to do. Come on, I will introduce you to the crew." The men gathered near the barn were a mixed group, ranging from a grizzled older man with a gray beard to a fresh-faced boy who could not have been more than 17. They all stopped what they were doing and stared openly when Xavier rode up with Faith at his side. "Boys, this is Faith Carmichael. She is going to be helping us with the drive to the upper pastures. I expect you all to treat her with respect and remember that she is working just as hard as any of you." Xavier's voice had taken on a tone of authority that made it clear this was not a request but an order. The older man with the gray beard stepped forward, looking Faith up and down with shrewd eyes. "Can she ride, boss? Because we do not have time to be nursemaiding anyone on this drive." "I can ride just fine," Faith said evenly before Xavier could respond. "And I can rope and herd and do whatever else needs doing. I am not here to be a burden, and I do not expect any special treatment." The old man's weathered face cracked into a grin. "Well, all right then. Name is Frank Morrison, and I have been ramrodding this outfit since before most of these pups were born. You stay close to me today, and I will show you how we do things." The other men introduced themselves with varying degrees of enthusiasm. There was Charlie, the fresh-faced young man who blushed when he shook Faith's hand. There was Marcus and Thomas, brothers from Texas who had the same dark hair and sharp features. And there was Samuel, a quiet black man about Xavier's age, who had kind eyes and a thoughtful way of speaking. Faith made a point of meeting each man's gaze directly and shaking hands firmly, establishing from the first moment that she was not going to be intimidated or pushed around. The work of moving the cattle began in earnest as the sun climbed higher in the sky. It was hot, dusty, exhausting work that required constant attention and quick reflexes. The cattle did not want to leave the lower pastures where the grazing was easy, and they had to be hazed and herded and sometimes roped individually to get them moving in the right direction. Faith quickly fell into the rhythm of it, working alongside Frank and following his terse instructions. Xavier rode back and forth along the line, checking on his men and helping wherever an extra hand was needed. Faith found herself acutely aware of his presence, noticing the way he sat his horse with unconscious grace and the way his voice carried calm authority even when things got chaotic. Once, when a young steer broke away from the herd and went crashing through the brush, Xavier and Faith went after it together, working in tandem to turn it back toward the group. When they finally got the steer moving in the right direction, Xavier looked over at her with a grin that made her heart skip in her chest. "You are a natural at this," he shouted over the noise of the cattle and the pounding of hooves. "My father raised cattle back in Missouri," she shouted back. "I grew up doing this kind of work." By the time they stopped for a noon meal, Faith was soaked with sweat and covered in dust, but she felt more alive than she had in months. There was something exhilarating about the physical challenge of the work, the partnership with the horse beneath her, and the satisfaction of doing something difficult and doing it well. The men had stopped looking at her with skepticism and started treating her like just another hand, which was exactly what she wanted. They ate dried beef and hard biscuits, washing it down with water from canteens. Faith found herself sitting on a fallen log next to Samuel, who asked her quiet questions about where she had come from and what had brought her to California. She told him about her father's death and her brother's marriage, about the decision to head west and claim her own land. "That takes courage," Samuel said thoughtfully. "Most people would have taken the easier path, tried to find security where they could get it. Security is not worth much if it means giving up who you are, Faith said, and Samuel nodded as if she had said something profound. Xavier joined them after a few minutes, settling on the ground with his back against a tree trunk. How are you holding up? He asked Faith. Just fine, she said. This is good work. I have missed it, to be honest. There is only so much satisfaction you can get from swinging an axe, even when you are building something important. I can imagine, Xavier said, and there was that note of respect in his voice again that made something warm unfurl in Faith's chest. You know, if you ever want to earn some extra money once your cabin is built, I could use someone with your skills. We always need help during roundup and branding season. I will keep that in mind, Faith said, surprised by how appealing the offer sounded. She had been so focused on building her cabin and establishing her homestead that she had not thought much about what would come after. But the idea of working alongside these men, of being part of something larger than just her solitary struggle, had an undeniable appeal. The afternoon was harder than the morning, as the cattle grew more stubborn and the heat became oppressive. Faith's arms ached from controlling her horse, and her throat was raw from breathing in dust, but she did not complain or ask for a break. She noticed Xavier watching her several times, his expression thoughtful, but he did not try to coddle her or suggest she should rest while the men continued working. By the time they finally got the herd settled in the upper pastures and turned back toward the ranch, the sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold across the western sky. Faith was exhausted in a way that went bone deep, but it was a good kind of tired, the satisfaction of a hard day's work completed successfully. Back at the ranch, Xavier's housekeeper, a stout Mexican woman named Rosa, had prepared a feast of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie that made Faith's mouth water. The men ate with the single-minded focus of people who had burned thousands of calories and needed to replace them quickly. Faith matched them bite for bite, too hungry to worry about eating daintily or maintaining any sort of feminine pretense. After dinner, Xavier walked her to the bunkhouse where Rosa had prepared a small private room for her. You did good work today, he said as they stood in the gathering darkness. Better than good, actually. Frank told me you were the best natural rider he had seen in years. Faith felt her cheeks warm with pleasure at the compliment. Frank is a good teacher. He made sure I knew where I needed to be and what I needed to do. That is part of it, Xavier said. But the rest is just talent and hard work, and those are things you have got in abundance. He paused, and in the dim light from the lamp hanging on the bunkhouse porch, his face was all shadows and plains. I meant what I said about never meeting a woman like you, Faith. You are something special. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment they just stood there, close enough that she could hear him breathing. Then Xavier took a step back, touching the brim of his hat in that gesture she was coming to recognize. Get some rest. Tomorrow is going to be another long day. Faith lay awake in the narrow bunk for a long time that night, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling down around her. She could hear horses moving in the corral, the low murmur of men's voices from the main bunkhouse, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote calling to the moon. She thought about Xavier's words, the warmth in his voice when he said she was something special, and the way her heart had hammered when he stood close to her in the darkness. This was not what she had planned. She had not come west to fall for some rancher with blue eyes and a slow smile. She had come west to be independent, to build something of her own, to prove that she did not need a man to take care of her. But lying there in the darkness, Faith had to admit that what she was feeling for Xavier had nothing to do with needing to be taken care of. It was something else entirely, something that made her feel both exhilarated and terrified in equal measure. The next 2 days followed a similar pattern. They worked from dawn until dusk, moving cattle and mending fences and doing the 100 small tasks that kept a ranch running smoothly. Faith threw herself into the work with determination, proving again and again that she could handle whatever was asked of her. The men stopped treating her like a curiosity and started treating her like a colleague, asking her opinion and trusting her to handle difficult tasks on her own. And through it all, she was aware of Xavier. The way he moved with such easy confidence, the way his face softened when he smiled, the timbre of his voice when he spoke her name. She caught him watching her more than once, and the expression in his eyes made her pulse quicken and her breath come faster. There was something building between them, something that felt as inevitable as the changing seasons, and Faith found herself both anticipating and dreading what might happen when it finally broke through the surface. On the last evening, after the work was done and the men had eaten their fill of Rosa's cooking, Faith found herself alone with Xavier on the porch of the main house. The stars were coming out overhead, more stars than she had ever seen in her life, spreading across the sky like diamonds scattered on black velvet. "I have arranged for some of my men to bring the lumber over to your place tomorrow," Xavier said, his voice quiet in the stillness. "It is good quality pine, already milled and ready to use. Should be more than enough to finish your roof and have some left over for whatever else you might need." "You are being too generous," Faith said softly. 3 days of work does not equal all those supplies, and enough lumber to finish my cabin." Xavier turned to look at her, and his eyes reflected the lamplight from inside the house. "Maybe I've got my own reasons for wanting to help you, Faith." Her heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. What reasons might those be? He was quiet for a long moment, and Faith could see him struggling with something internal, some decision he was trying to make. Finally, he said, "I have been alone for a long time. After the war, I came out here thinking I just wanted to build something, to have land and cattle and a place to call my own. And I did build all that, and it has been satisfying in its way. But lately, I have been realizing that having all this does not mean much if there is no one to share it with." Faith's breath caught in her throat. She knew she should say something, but the words seemed stuck somewhere between her heart and her mouth. Xavier continued, his voice low and earnest. "Then you showed up building your cabin with your own 2 hands, refusing to let anyone tell you that you could not do it. And I started thinking maybe I'd been wrong about what I wanted. Maybe what I really needed was not just someone to share what I already have, but someone who understands what it means to build something from nothing, someone who has got that same fire and determination." "Xavier," Faith said, and her voice came out barely above a whisper, "I came out here to be independent, to prove I did not need anyone else." "I know," he said, "and you have proved it, Faith. You have proved you can do anything you set your mind to. But being independent does not mean you have to be alone. It just means you get to choose who you want to be with and why." He stepped closer, and Faith found she could not move, could not breathe. Her entire world had narrowed down to this moment, this man standing in front of her with his heart in his eyes. "I am not asking you to give up your cabin or your land or any of your dreams," Xavier said softly. "I am just asking if maybe there is room in those dreams for someone else, someone who thinks you are the most remarkable woman he has ever met, someone who wants to help you build whatever you want to build, not because you need the help, but because he wants to be part of it." Faith felt tears prick her eyes, and she blinked them back furiously. She had spent so long building walls around her heart, convincing herself that she did not need anyone, that depending on another person was a weakness she could not afford. But standing here under the stars with Xavier looking at her like she was something precious and rare, she realized that maybe she had been wrong. Maybe real strength was not about doing everything alone. Maybe it was about being brave enough to let someone in, even when it was terrifying. "I am scared," she admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I am scared of losing myself again, of becoming someone's wife and forgetting who I am." Xavier reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough with calluses, solid and real. "I do not want you to be someone's wife in the way you are thinking. I want you to be Faith Carmichael, who built her own cabin. I want you to be the woman who can ride all day and work as hard as any man, and still have the strength to argue with me when you think I am wrong. I would never want you to be anything less than exactly who you are." A tear slipped down Faith's cheek, and she did not bother to wipe it away. "This is not what I planned," she said, but she was smiling through the tears. "Plans change," Xavier said gently. "And sometimes the things we did not plan turn out to be the best things that ever happened to us." Faith took a shaky breath, and then she did something that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and rose up on her toes to press her lips to his. Xavier made a soft sound of surprise and pleasure, and then his arms came around her, pulling her close. He kissed her like she was something precious, his lips gentle against hers, one hand coming up to cup her face with infinite tenderness. Faith felt like she was falling and flying at the same time, like every nerve in her body had suddenly come alive. She had been kissed before, fumbling attempts from boys back in Missouri who had not known what they were doing. But this was different. This was a man who knew what he wanted and was brave enough to reach for it, kissing a woman who was finally brave enough to let herself be reached for. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the first day I rode up and saw you standing there with your axe, looking like some kind of pioneer warrior woman." Faith laughed, a breathless, joyful sound. "I was covered in dirt and sweat, and probably did not smell very good." "You were beautiful," Xavier said firmly. "You are beautiful, and not just the way you look, though that does not hurt. You are beautiful in the way you face the world, in your strength and your courage, and your absolute refusal to let anyone make you smaller than you are." They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms under the stars, and Faith felt something settle inside her that she had not even known was restless. This was right, terrifying and unexpected, and not at all what she had planned, but right in a way that went deeper than logic or reason. The next morning, Xavier rode with her back to her homestead, leading a wagon driven by Marcus and Thomas that was loaded with lumber and additional supplies. When they reached her property, Faith felt a surge of pride at how much progress she had made. The cabin walls were half finished, the foundation was solid, and there was a neat pile of logs waiting to be put into place. "You really have done all this yourself," Xavier said, and there was awe in his voice. "Well, I am going to need help with the roof," Faith admitted. "That is more than a one-person job." "Then it is a good thing I am here," Xavier said with a grin. Over the next 3 weeks, Xavier and his men helped Faith finish her cabin. They came every Sunday, which was traditionally a day of rest at the ranch, and worked alongside her to raise the walls, install the roof, and build a sturdy door and shutters for the windows. But Faith never let them do the work for her. She was there every step of the way, lifting and hammering and sawing, making sure that this cabin was truly something she had built with her own 2 hands, even if those hands had help from friends. Because that was what they were becoming, she realized. Friends. Xavier's ranch hands treated her with easy camaraderie now, joking and laughing with her like they would with any of their crew. Frank taught her how to improve her roping technique. Samuel shared stories about his own journey west after the war and the struggles he had faced trying to make a place for himself in a world that often did not want to give black men the opportunities they deserved. Charlie looked at her with something approaching hero worship, telling her about his own sister back in Kansas who wanted to come west but was afraid to make the journey alone. And Xavier was there through all of it, steady and supportive, working beside her, but never trying to take over or make decisions for her. In the evenings after the others had left, he would stay for a while, and they would sit together talking about their dreams and their fears and their pasts. Faith learned that Xavier had lost his parents young, that he had an older sister back east who thought he was crazy for ranching in California, and that his favorite thing in the world was watching the sunrise from the hills above his ranch. Xavier learned that Faith loved to read, but had left most of her books behind because they were too heavy to bring west, that she had once wanted to be a teacher, but had never had the opportunity for the education it would require, and that she secretly loved dancing even though she pretended to find it frivolous. "There is a town dance in Ukiah next month," Xavier said one evening as they sat on the porch of her nearly finished cabin. "Will you go with me?" Faith felt her stomach flip over. A dance meant announcing to the entire town that they were courting, that she and Xavier were something more than just neighbors helping each other out. It felt like a big step, one that would make their relationship real in a way it had not been when it was just the two of them alone under the stars. "Yes," she heard herself say, "I would like that." Xavier's face lit up with a smile that made him look years younger. He reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers, and they sat like that in comfortable silence as the sun set over the California mountains. The cabin was finished on the first day of October. Faith stood in the doorway, looking at the sturdy walls and the solid roof and the stone fireplace that Xavier had helped her build, and felt tears of accomplishment streaming down her face. She had done it. She had actually done it. This cabin, this home was hers in a way nothing had ever been hers before. Xavier came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on top of her head. "You should be proud," he said softly. "This is an amazing thing you have built." "We built," Faith corrected. "I could not have done the roof or the fireplace without your help. You could have figured it out eventually," Xavier said with absolute certainty. "You are too stubborn to let a little thing like not knowing how to do something stop you." Faith laughed and turned in his arms, looking up at him. Over the past weeks, his face had become as familiar to her as her own, every line and angle memorized through long hours of working side by side. She knew the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the exact shade of blue his eyes turned in different lights, and the way one eyebrow quirked up when he was amused by something but trying not to show it. "I love you," she said, the words coming out before she had consciously decided to say them. "I did not mean to, and I did not plan on it, but I do. I love you, Xavier Donnelly." His arms tightened around her, and his eyes blazed with an intensity that took her breath away. "Thank God," he said roughly, "because I have been in love with you since I rode up here that first day and saw you standing there like you could take on the whole world with just your axe and your determination. I love you, Faith Carmichael. I love your strength and your courage and the way you never back down from a challenge. I love the way you laugh and the way you argue with me when you think I am wrong. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life loving you, if you will let me." Faith pulled his head down and kissed him with all the passion and joy and love that was overflowing from her heart. This kiss was different from their first, less tentative and more certain, a promise of all the kisses yet to come. Xavier kissed her back with matching intensity, his hands sliding into her hair and pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xavier said, "Marry me, Faith, not because you need me or because I need you, but because we are better together than we are apart, because I want to wake up next to you every morning and work beside you every day and fall asleep holding you every night. Marry me and let us build a life together, the same way we built this cabin, piece by piece with our own two hands." Faith felt like her heart might burst from the sheer force of the happiness flooding through her. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you, Xavier. I want all of that. I want everything." The town dance came 2 weeks later, and Faith wore a dress she had carefully sewn from fabric she bought in Ukiah with some of the money she had earned working Xavier's cattle drive. It was a simple dress, dark blue cotton with a fitted bodice and full skirt, but she had embroidered small white flowers around the neckline and cuffs. Rosa had helped her curl her hair, and when Faith looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She looked happy, she realized with some surprise. Not just content or satisfied, but genuinely, radiantly happy. Xavier called for her in a wagon cleaned until it gleamed, wearing a suit that looked uncomfortable on his rangy frame, but made him devastatingly handsome. His eyes widened when he saw her, and he just stood there staring for a long moment before managing to say, "Faith, you are absolutely beautiful." She felt her cheeks warm with pleasure. "You clean up pretty well yourself, Cowboy." The dance was held in the town hall, a large wooden building that served as a gathering space for everything from church services to town meetings. By the time Faith and Xavier arrived, it was already crowded with people from all over the valley. Faith recognized some faces from her trips into town, though she had not made many friends yet, having been too focused on her cabin building to socialize much. The moment they walked in together, Faith felt the weight of curious stares. She knew what people were thinking, what they were probably saying behind their hands. There was that strange woman who built her own cabin, and she had managed to catch Xavier Donnelly's attention, the most eligible bachelor in the county. There would be gossip and speculation, and probably a fair amount of disapproval from the more conservative townspeople who thought women should stay in their proper place. Faith lifted her chin and met those stares directly, her hand firm on Xavier's arm. Let them talk. She knew who she was, and she knew what she and Xavier had together was real and valuable, and that was all that mattered. "Ignore them," Xavier murmured in her ear as they made their way across the room. "They are just jealous because they do not have the courage to go after what they really want in life." Faith squeezed his arm gratefully, and then they were swept up in the festivities. The band struck up a lively reel, and Xavier led her onto the dance floor with a confidence that surprised her until she remembered he had said he loved dancing. He was good at it too, moving with the same easy grace he showed on horseback, leading her through the steps with practiced skill. They danced together through 3 songs before other people started cutting in, ranchers wanting to dance with Faith and their wives wanting to dance with Xavier. Faith found herself passed from partner to partner, some friendly and welcoming, others clearly dancing with her out of curiosity rather than genuine warmth. But she held her head high and smiled and made polite conversation, determined not to let anyone make her feel small or out of place. Between dances, women clustered around her, asking questions about her cabin and how she had managed to build it herself, and was it true she had helped with a cattle drive at the Donnelly Ranch. Faith answered honestly, neither downplaying her accomplishments nor bragging about them, just stating the facts of what she had done. Some of the women looked at her with admiration, others with something that might have been envy, and a few with outright disapproval. One older woman wearing a severe black dress and an even more severe expression actually sniffed and said, "Well, I think it is highly improper for a young woman to be doing such rough work. You should have found yourself a husband to take care of those things for you." Before Faith could respond, another voice cut in. Maybe she did not want a husband to take care of things for her. Maybe she wanted to prove she could do it herself. The speaker was a young woman about Faith's age, with red hair and a smattering of freckles across her nose. She smiled at Faith with genuine warmth. "I am Margaret Porter. My husband and I have a small farm about 2 miles from your place. I have been meaning to ride over and introduce myself, but we have been so busy with the harvest." "Faith Carmichael," Faith said, grateful for the friendly face. "And thank you for that. It is nice to know I have a neighbor who does not think I am completely scandalous." Margaret laughed. "Oh, I think you are a little bit scandalous, but in the best possible way. What you did, building that cabin yourself, is amazing. I only wish I had half your courage." They talked for a while, and Faith learned that Margaret and her husband Jonathan had a 5-year-old daughter and were expecting their second child. Margaret confessed that she sometimes felt trapped by the endless cycle of cooking and cleaning and child rearing, that she sometimes dreamed of doing something bigger and bolder with her life. "But I love my family," she said quickly, as if afraid Faith would judge her. "I just sometimes wish there was more, you know." "I know," Faith said gently. "And loving your family does not mean you cannot want other things too." Xavier appeared at her elbow as the band struck up a waltz. "May I have this dance?" he asked formally, extending his hand. Faith placed her hand in his and let him lead her back onto the dance floor. The waltz was slower, and more intimate than the reels and jigs they had danced earlier, requiring them to stay close together, his hand firm on her waist and hers resting on his shoulder. They moved together in perfect synchronization, and Faith felt like they were the only two people in the room. "Having a good time?" Xavier asked softly. "I am now," Faith said, smiling up at him. "Though I will admit some of the townspeople make me feel like a curiosity in a traveling show." "They will get used to you," Xavier said confidently. "And once we are married, they will have to accept you as part of the community, whether they like it or not." "Speaking of which," Faith said, "have you given any thought to when you might want to have a wedding?" Xavier's eyes grew serious. "I would marry you tomorrow if you were willing, but I know women usually want time to plan these things, to have a proper dress and all that." Faith thought about it for a moment. She had never been the kind of girl who dreamed about a big fancy wedding. What mattered to her was the commitment, the promise they would be making to each other, not the ceremony itself. "I do not need anything fancy," she said slowly, "but I would like to do it properly, with a minister and witnesses and everything legal. Maybe in a month or so, that would give me time to make a decent dress, and for you to make whatever arrangements you need to make." "A month sounds perfect," Xavier said, and he pulled her a little closer as they swayed to the music. "I cannot wait to make you my wife, Faith." "I cannot wait to be your wife," Faith said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They set the wedding for the first Saturday in November, which gave them just over a month to prepare. Faith threw herself into the preparations with the same determination she had brought to building her cabin. She sewed herself a wedding dress from cream-colored silk that had cost more than she wanted to admit, but was absolutely worth it. She baked bread and pies to serve at the celebration afterward. She scrubbed her cabin until every surface gleamed and picked wildflowers to dry for bouquets. Xavier, meanwhile, made arrangements with the minister in Ukiah and invited everyone from his ranch and half the valley besides to come celebrate with them. He also, without telling Faith, hired a carpenter to build furniture for her cabin, including a beautiful wooden bed frame, a table with 4 chairs, and a rocking chair that he said was for sitting in front of the fire on cold winter nights. When Faith saw the furniture being delivered, she tried to protest that it was too much, but Xavier just wrapped his arms around her and said, "You built the house. Let me help fill it with things to make it a home." Margaret Porter proved to be a true friend in those weeks leading up to the wedding. She came over several times to help with preparations, bringing her daughter Emma along to play outside while the women worked. Margaret helped Faith finish her wedding dress, adding delicate lace trim to the sleeves and hem that Faith would never have managed on her own. In return, Faith helped Margaret and Jonathan with their harvest, spending several back-breaking days picking apples and squash and storing them away for the winter. Xavier's ranch hands had become friends as well, stopping by regularly to help Faith with tasks around her property. Frank helped her dig a better well closer to the cabin. Samuel taught her how to preserve meat for the winter. Even young Charlie contributed, building her a chicken coop and arriving one day with 6 laying hens as an early wedding present. Faith had never had so many people in her life who cared about her well-being and wanted to help her succeed. Back in Missouri, she had been alone after her mother died, essentially invisible in her brother's household once his wife took over. But here in California, she was building not just a cabin, but a community, a network of people who valued her for who she was and what she could contribute. The night before the wedding, Faith stayed at Margaret and Jonathan's house, following the tradition that the bride and groom should not see each other before the ceremony. She lay awake in the guest room, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, and thinking about how much her life was about to change. Tomorrow she would be Faith Donnelly instead of Faith Carmichael. She would be Xavier's wife, partner, helpmate. But even as she took on that new identity, she knew she would not be losing herself. Xavier had made it clear over and over that he valued her independence and her strength, that he did not want her to become someone different just because she was getting married. They had talked long and hard about how their life together would work, about how she would keep her cabin and her land while also spending time at his ranch, about how they would make decisions together as partners rather than him dictating and her obeying. It would not always be easy, Faith knew. They were both strong-willed people with their own ideas about how things should be done. They would argue and disagree and probably drive each other crazy sometimes. But underneath all of that was a foundation of love and respect that Faith trusted absolutely. They would figure it out together, the same way they had figured everything else out. The wedding day dawned clear and beautiful, with a crisp autumn chill in the air that promised winter was not far off. Margaret helped Faith into her dress and styled her hair, weaving dried flowers through the blonde strands that she had curled and pinned up. When Faith looked at herself in the mirror, she saw a woman transformed not by the dress or the hair, but by the joy radiating from her eyes. "You look like a princess in a fairy tale," little Emma said in an awed voice. "Thank you, sweetheart," Faith said, bending down to drop a kiss on the girl's head. "And thank you," she said to Margaret, "for everything, for being my friend and helping me with all of this, and just being someone I can talk to." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You do not have to thank me. That is what friends do. And I am so happy for you, Faith. You and Xavier are going to have a wonderful life together." The ceremony was held in the church in Ukiah, a small white building with a bell tower and stained glass windows that sent colored light streaming across the wooden pews. The church was packed with people, more people than Faith would have thought even knew who she was. Xavier's ranch hands were there, cleaned up and wearing their Sunday best. Margaret and Jonathan sat in the front row with Emma between them. There were ranchers and farmers and townspeople, all gathered to witness this unlikely union. And at the front of the church, standing next to the minister in a dark suit that made his blue eyes even more striking, was Xavier. When Faith started down the aisle on Frank's arm, having asked the old cowboy to give her away since she had no family of her own present, Xavier's face transformed with an expression of such pure love and joy that Faith felt tears prick her eyes. Frank deposited her next to Xavier with a gruff, "You take good care of her, boss, or you will answer to me," which made several people in the congregation chuckle. "I will," Xavier promised solemnly, taking Faith's hands in his. "I will take care of her for the rest of my life." The minister began the ceremony, speaking about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. Faith barely heard the words, too focused on Xavier's face, on the way his hands held hers so gently, on the way his eyes never left hers for even a moment. This was really happening. She was really marrying this man who had seen her at her most exhausted and dirty and had still thought she was remarkable. This man who had supported her dreams instead of trying to make her smaller. This man who loved her not despite her strength, but because of it. When it came time for the vows, Xavier spoke his in a clear, firm voice that carried to every corner of the church. "I, Xavier, take you, Faith, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you and cherish you, to support your dreams, and stand by your side through whatever challenges we face. I promise to treat you as my equal partner in all things, to respect your strength and your independence, and to never ask you to be anything less than the remarkable woman you are. I promise to build a life with you that honors both of us, and to love you faithfully until my last breath." Faith felt tears streaming down her face as she spoke her own vows. "I, Faith, take you, Xavier, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to love you with all my heart, to be your partner and your friend, to work beside you and support you in all your endeavors. I promise to bring my whole self to this marriage, holding nothing back, trusting you with my heart, even though that terrifies me. I promise to build a life with you that is big enough for both our dreams and to love you faithfully for as long as we both shall live." The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Xavier kissed her with such tenderness and passion that Faith forgot they were standing in front of a church full of people. She kissed him back with all the love in her heart, sealing the promise they had just made to each other. The celebration afterward was held at Xavier's ranch, with tables set up in the yard and food enough to feed an army. Rosa had outdone herself, preparing a feast of roasted beef, fresh bread, vegetables from the ranch garden, and 3 different kinds of pie. The ranch hands had hung lanterns from the trees, creating a magical atmosphere as the sun set and darkness fell. Someone produced a fiddle, and soon there was music and dancing and laughter that rang out across the valley. Faith danced with Xavier, with Frank, with Samuel and Marcus and Thomas and Jonathan, and even little Charlie, who blushed furiously the entire time. She was passed from partner to partner until her feet ached and her face hurt from smiling. But she would not have stopped for anything. This was her wedding day, the day she married the man she loved, and she wanted to remember every moment of it. Late in the evening, when the party was still going strong, but some of the guests had started to drift home, Xavier pulled Faith aside. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Donnelly?" he asked, his eyes warm in the lantern light. "Home," Faith repeated, testing out the word. "Which home do you mean? I have got my cabin, and you have got your ranch house." "Tonight, let us go to your cabin," Xavier said. "The one you built with your own 2 hands. I want to carry you over the threshold of the home you created and start our married life there." Faith felt her heart swell with love for this man who understood without being told how important that would be to her. "Yes," she said softly. "Let us go home." They said their goodbyes to the remaining guests, enduring good-natured teasing and advice from the ranch hands and hugs from the friends they had made. Margaret whispered in Faith's ear, "Be happy and do not let anyone ever make you feel like you have to be less than you are." Faith hugged her tightly, grateful beyond words for this friendship. The ride to Faith's cabin took about an hour, the horses moving slowly through the darkness with only moonlight to guide them. Xavier kept one arm around Faith the entire way, holding her close against his side. They did not talk much, content to be together in the peaceful night. When they reached the cabin, Xavier dismounted and then lifted Faith down from her horse. Instead of setting her on her feet, he carried her up the 2 steps to the door, pausing there for a moment. "I am so proud of you," he said quietly, "for building this, for having the courage to come out here alone, for being the incredible woman you are. I am the luckiest man alive." "I am pretty lucky myself," Faith said, her arms around his neck. "I never expected to find love out here. I thought I was coming west to be alone, to be independent. But you showed me that I can be all those things and still have someone to share my life with." Xavier carried her over the threshold and set her gently on her feet inside the cabin. In the darkness, Faith could just make out the shapes of the furniture Xavier had bought, the bed they would share for the first time tonight, the table where they would eat countless meals together, the rocking chair where perhaps she would one day nurse babies. That thought made her blush, and she was grateful for the darkness hiding her red cheeks. But Xavier seemed to know what she was thinking anyway. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her gently. "We have got all the time in the world," he murmured against her lips. "There is no rush for anything. I just want to be with you, Faith. Everything else will come in its own time." Faith kissed him back, pouring all her love and trust and hope for the future into that kiss. Xavier responded with matching passion, his hands sliding into her hair and scattering the pins that held it up so that blonde waves tumbled down around her shoulders. They made their way to the bed, fumbling with buttons and laces in the darkness, laughing softly at their own awkwardness. Their first time together was tender and sweet, full of whispered words and gentle touches and the joy of discovery. Xavier was patient and careful, making sure Faith felt safe and cherished every moment. And Faith, who had been afraid of losing herself in marriage, found instead that she felt more wholly herself than ever before. This was not about giving up her independence. This was about sharing it with someone who valued it as much as she did. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, Faith's head resting on Xavier's chest, and his arms wrapped securely around her. Through the window, she could see stars scattered across the night sky, the same stars that had been there the night she first arrived at this land claim, alone and determined to build something of her own. She had built her cabin, proved she could survive on her own strength. But now she had built something else too, something just as important. She had built a partnership, a love, a future that was bigger and brighter than anything she could have created alone. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Xavier whispered back. "Today, tomorrow, and for all the rest of our days." The first winter of their marriage was harder than either of them had expected, but not in the ways they had feared. The cabin stayed warm and dry, proof of how well Faith had built it. The ranch prospered, with cattle selling for good prices and no major disasters befalling them. But learning to blend their two lives into one shared life required constant negotiation and compromise. Faith spent 3 days a week at the ranch, helping Xavier with whatever work needed doing and learning the ins and outs of running a large operation. She had a natural talent for managing the books, and Xavier gratefully turned over that responsibility to her, admitting he had never been good with numbers. The other 4 days, she worked on her own land, expanding her cabin to include a covered porch and a small barn, starting a vegetable garden, and acquiring a few cattle of her own that she ran on her property. Sometimes they argued about where they should spend their time, with Xavier wanting Faith at the ranch more often and Faith needing her independence and her own space. But they always talked through their disagreements, always found compromises that honored both their needs. And every night, whether they were sleeping at the cabin or at the ranch house, they fell asleep in each other's arms, grateful for the love they shared. Margaret became Faith's closest friend, visiting regularly and bringing Emma along to play. Faith taught Margaret how to shoot and ride better, skills Margaret had always wanted to improve, but had never had anyone to teach her. In return, Margaret taught Faith how to can vegetables and make preserves, skills that Faith's mother had died before passing on. The ranch hands remained good friends as well, treating Faith as one of their own and respecting her opinions on ranch matters. Frank in particular became something of a father figure to Faith, gruff and demanding but fiercely protective. He taught her how to train horses, how to read the weather, and 100 other skills that would serve her well in the years to come. Spring brought new challenges and new joys. Faith discovered she was pregnant in March, a realization that filled her with equal parts excitement and terror. She had never been around babies much, had no mother or sisters to teach her about motherhood, but Rosa took her under her wing, sharing wisdom and practical advice, and Margaret assured her that no one really knew what they were doing with their first baby, and that was perfectly normal. Xavier was overjoyed at the news, his face lighting up with such pure happiness that Faith felt her own fears ease. He immediately became protective, worrying about her working too hard or taking unnecessary risks. But he learned to trust Faith's judgment about her own body and capabilities, understanding that she knew her own limits better than he did. Their daughter was born in November, almost exactly 1 year after their wedding day. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Faith was sure she could not do it, could not endure another minute of pain. But Margaret held one hand, and Xavier held the other, and Rosa coached her through it all. And finally, there was a thin wailing cry, and a tiny red-faced baby girl was placed in Faith's arms. "She is perfect," Xavier said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked down at his daughter. "She is absolutely perfect." They named her Hope because she represented all their hopes for the future, all the dreams they had built together. Hope had her mother's blonde hair and her father's blue eyes, and from the very beginning, she had a stubborn determination that made both her parents laugh, even as it exhausted them. Being a mother was harder than anything Faith had ever done, including building her cabin. The sleepless nights, the constant worry, the overwhelming responsibility of keeping this tiny human alive and healthy, all of it pushed Faith to her limits. But it was also more rewarding than she ever could have imagined. Watching Hope grow and change, seeing her smile for the first time, hearing her first laugh, All of it filled Faith with a fierce, protective love she had not known she was capable of feeling. Xavier was a devoted father, taking on as much of the baby care as he could despite the demands of the ranch. He would get up in the middle of the night to walk with Hope when she was fussy, sing to her in his deep voice until she fell asleep, and spend hours just staring at her in wonder. Watching him with their daughter, Faith fell in love with him all over again, deeper and more completely than she had thought possible. The years passed in a blur of work and love and the everyday challenges of building a life together. They had two more children, a son they named Daniel, born 2 years after Hope, and another daughter named Rose, born 3 years after that. The cabin that Faith had built with her own two hands expanded to accommodate their growing family, with Xavier and Faith working together to add two more rooms and a larger kitchen. The ranch prospered under their joint management, growing from a modestly successful operation to one of the most productive in the valley. Faith's skill with numbers and organization, combined with Xavier's knowledge of cattle and land management, proved to be an unbeatable combination. They earned a reputation for fair dealing and quality livestock, and other ranchers started coming to them for advice. Faith never gave up her independence, never lost herself in the role of wife and mother the way she had once feared she might. She continued to work her own land, to ride and rope and do all the things that made her feel most alive. Xavier supported her completely, understanding that her strength and independence were not threats to their marriage, but essential parts of who she was. They faced challenges, of course. There were years when the cattle prices dropped and they barely made ends meet. There was a terrible drought when Hope was 5 that killed off half their herd and forced them to make hard decisions about which animals to save. There were illnesses and injuries and all the everyday disasters that came with ranching and raising children. But through it all, they had each other. They had built something strong and lasting, a partnership based on love and respect, and the absolute certainty that they were better together than they ever could have been apart. On their 20th anniversary, Xavier surprised Faith by taking her back to the original cabin, the one she had built with her own two hands. They had not been there in months, having moved permanently to the ranch house once the children started getting older and needing more space. The cabin was used now mostly for storage and as a guest house when they had visitors. But as Faith stepped inside and looked around at the solid walls, the sturdy fireplace, the roof that still did not leak after all these years, she felt a surge of pride and gratitude. This cabin represented everything she had been when she first came west, all her determination and courage and refusal to be limited by anyone else's expectations. And it represented everything she had become since, all the ways she had grown and changed while still remaining fundamentally herself. "I am so glad I built this cabin," she said softly, leaning back against Xavier's chest as he wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Not just because it gave me a place to live, but because it proved to me that I could do hard things, that I could be independent and strong and capable." "You built more than a cabin," Xavier said, his voice warm against her ear. "You built a life. You built a family. You built a love that has sustained us through everything. I told you the first day I met you that I had never met a woman like you, and that is still true 20 years later. You are the most remarkable person I have ever known, Faith." Faith turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring 20 years of love and gratitude into that kiss. "We built all of that together," she said when they finally broke apart. "The cabin I built alone, but everything else, the life and the family and the love, we built that together." They stood there for a long time, holding each other in the cabin Faith had built with her own two hands, looking back on all they had accomplished and forward to all the years still ahead. Outside, the California sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange and pink. In the distance, they could hear the sounds of their children playing, their laughter ringing out clear and bright in the evening air. Faith thought about the young woman she had been when she first arrived here, so determined to prove she did not need anyone, so convinced that independence meant being alone. And she thought about the woman she had become, a wife and mother and rancher. independent still but no longer alone, surrounded by people who loved her and whom she loved in return. She had built her cabin with her own two hands, and the cowboy had said he had never met a woman like her. And from that unlikely beginning, they had built something even more remarkable. They had built a love that lasted, a family that thrived, and a life that was richer and fuller than anything either of them could have created alone. As the sun disappeared below the horizon and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Xavier took Faith's hand and led her back toward the ranch house, toward their children and their life together. Faith went willingly, knowing that while the cabin would always hold a special place in her heart, her real home was not a building or a piece of land. Her home was wherever Xavier was, wherever their family was, wherever love and respect and partnership flourished. The cabin remained standing for many years after, a testament to Faith's skill and determination. And whenever their grandchildren asked to hear stories about the old days, Faith would take them to the cabin and tell them about the young woman who had come west alone, who had claimed a piece of land and built a home with her own two hands, and who had found love with a cowboy who saw her strength and valued it above all else. Never be afraid to build your own dreams, she would tell them, but never be afraid to share those dreams with someone who truly loves you either. Independence is not about being alone. It is about being strong enough to choose your own path and wise enough to let someone walk beside you on that path when you find the right person. And her grandchildren would nod seriously, taking in this wisdom, and Faith would smile and think about how far she had come from that young woman with an axe and a dream. She had built her cabin, yes, but she had built so much more. She had built a life worth living, filled with love and purpose and joy. And that, she knew, was the greatest accomplishment of all. As Faith grew older, her hair turning from blonde to silver and her hands becoming gnarled with arthritis, she never lost that core of strength and determination that had brought her west all those years ago. She and Xavier ran the ranch together until they were both well into their 60s, only then turning over day-to-day operations to Daniel, who had inherited his parents' love of the land and their skill at managing it. Hope married a teacher from Ukiah and started a school for ranch children in the valley, fulfilling the dream her mother had once had of teaching. Rose became a doctor, one of the first women physicians in California, and set up practice in San Francisco while still coming home regularly to visit her family. All three children carried with them the lessons their parents had taught them about strength and independence and the importance of partnership and love. Xavier and Faith spent their final years living mostly at the cabin Faith had built, coming full circle to where their story had truly begun. They would sit on the porch in the rocking chairs Xavier had built to replace the original one that had finally worn out, holding hands and watching the sun set over the mountains, grateful for every day they had together. Xavier died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, slipping away in the night with Faith's hand in his. Faith mourned him deeply, missing his presence with an ache that never fully went away. But she did not fall apart without him. She was still Faith Carmichael Donnelly, the woman who had built her own cabin, the woman who had proved she could do anything she set her mind to. Xavier's death left a hole in her heart that would never be filled, but it did not diminish who she was or what she had accomplished. She lived another 8 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, still sharp and capable almost to the very end. And when her time finally came, she died in the cabin she had built, in the bed she had shared with Xavier, with her family gathered around her. At her funeral, people came from all over the valley to pay their respects. She had become something of a legend over the years, the woman who had come west alone and built her own cabin, who had helped build one of the most successful ranches in California, who had raised 3 remarkable children and touched countless lives with her strength and kindness and wisdom. Hope spoke at the service, telling stories about her mother's courage and determination and the lessons she had taught her children about being true to themselves. "My mother built her own cabin with her own 2 hands," Hope said, her voice steady, despite the tears streaming down her face. But that cabin was just the beginning. She built a life based on love and respect. and partnership. She built a family that spans 3 generations now. She built a legacy that will live on long after we are all gone. She was the strongest person I ever knew and the kindest, and I am so grateful I got to be her daughter. The cabin still stands today, preserved by Faith and Xavier's descendants as a monument to their remarkable love story. Visitors can walk through it and see the solid construction, the careful craftsmanship, the evidence of a woman who refused to be limited by society's expectations of what she could and could not do. And if you stand very still and listen carefully, you might almost hear the echo of an axe biting into wood and a deep voice saying, "I never met a woman like you." Because Faith Carmichael built her cabin with her own 2 hands, and a cowboy named Xavier Donnelly saw her strength and loved her for it. And together, they built something even more enduring than walls and roof and stone fireplace. They built a love that lasted a lifetime, a family that thrived for generations, and a story that reminds us all that true partnership does not diminish our strength but multiplies it. That independence is not about being alone, but about being free to choose our own path, and that the greatest things we build in life are not structures made of wood and stone, but relationships made of love and respect, an unwavering commitment to seeing and valuing each other exactly as we are.